The wedding dress still smelled like someone else's perfume. I noticed it the moment they buttoned the last clasp at the back of my neck, a faint trace of something floral and expensive, clinging to the ivory fabric like a ghost that refused to leave. Nobody said anything. The two women who had dressed me moved in, practiced silence, adjusting the veil, smoothing the skirt, treating me with the careful efficiency of people preparing a package for delivery rather than a bride for her wedding day. I didn't say anything either. My name is Hazel Voss, and I had learned very early in life that saying things out loud didn't change them. It only made them more real. The room they had given me to prepare in was large and cold, one of the eastern chambers of the Black Pine Court, where the stone walls absorbed heat with a kind of stubborn indifference. The windows were tall, draped in heavy charcoal curtains that blocked most of the gray morning light. A single vanity mirror stood in the corner, and every time I looked at my reflection, I felt a strange doubling, as though the woman in the white dress was someone I was watching from a distance. Pale hair, pale skin, eyes the color of winter fog, a grayish green that people had always described as unusual, which was a polite way of saying wrong. I was 23 years old, and I was about to marry the Alpha King. Not because he wanted me, not because my family had negotiated something favorable or because any alliance of warmth existed between our packs. I knew the reason. Everyone in the Northern Territories knew the reason, even if they whispered it behind cupped hands and looked away when they saw me coming. My father had betrayed his. 5 years ago, Elias Voss, my father, the former beta of the Ironwood Pack, had passed intelligence to a rival faction during a territorial conflict. People had been lost because of it. Resources had been destroyed. Aiden Crest, who had just risen to the Alpha King's seat at 24, had spent 2 years dismantling the consequences of that betrayal. And when the dust finally settled and my father had nowhere left to run, Aiden had not taken his life or his freedom. He had taken me instead. A political marriage, his council had called it. A symbolic gesture of submission. My father's bloodline bound to his court, my existence a daily reminder to every other beta and elder who might consider defection that the Alpha King's reach was long and his memory was longer. I was the gesture. The door opened without a knock. A woman entered, tall, sharp-jawed, with dark hair pinned back so severely it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples. I recognized her. Mira, the king's head of household staff. She had been the one to collect me from my father's estate 3 days ago, moving through our home with inventory-like efficiency, speaking to my father in clipped sentences while I stood in the hallway holding a single travel bag. "The ceremony begins in 20 minutes, she said, not looking at me directly. "You'll walk alone. There's no processional music. The king prefers brevity." "Of course he does," I said. She paused. A flicker of something crossed her face. Surprise, maybe, that I had spoken at all. Then it was gone. "Don't be late." She left. I turned back to the mirror and looked at the woman in the white dress for a long, quiet moment. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees that surrounded Black Pine Court on 3 sides, a low sound like the forest breathing. The sky was the color of pewter. No sun. It felt appropriate. The great hall of Black Pine Court could hold 300 people. Today it held perhaps 80, alphas, betas, elders, and high-ranking members of the court's inner circle, all arranged in 2 loose groupings on either side of a central aisle that had been cleared of furniture. No flowers, no ribbon. The only decoration was the court's banner, a black pine tree on a field of deep gray, hanging above the dais where the ceremony would take place. I walked alone, as instructed. The faces I passed were not hostile exactly. They were measuring. People studying a transaction, calculating its weight. Some looked curious. A few looked openly pitying, which was somehow worse. A young woman near the back, maybe 17, with red hair and wide eyes, watched me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something between sympathy and dread. I kept my eyes forward. He was already standing at the dais when I reached it. I had heard descriptions of Aiden Crest. Everyone had. The Alpha King was spoken about the way storms were spoken about, not with admiration exactly, but with the particular respect people reserved for things that could not be reasoned with. Tall, broad, controlled in the way that only people with enormous capacity for destruction could be controlled, like a river that had decided, for now, to stay within its banks. The reality of him was quieter than I had expected. He wore no crown. Dark clothes, simply cut. His hair was black, slightly longer than formal, and his jaw carried the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from absolute self-containment. He was looking toward the elder who would conduct the ceremony, and as I stepped onto the dais beside him, he did not turn. He did not look at me at all. Not when the elder spoke the binding words. Not when he repeated the vow that the ritual required, his voice flat and precise, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. Not when the elder declared the bond formal, and the room offered a scattered, uncertain acknowledgement that passed for applause. He slid a ring onto my finger without looking at my hand. I felt the cold metal. Nothing else. When it was done, he stepped off the dais and moved through the crowd, stopping to speak to a broad-shouldered man with graying temples. His beta, I would learn later, a man named Cole. The two of them fell immediately into conversation, voices low, shoulders angled away from the room, away from me. I stood at the dais alone for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then the young woman with red hair appeared at my elbow, slightly breathless. "I'm supposed to show you to your rooms," she said quietly. Her voice was careful, like someone who had learned to speak in a house where noise had consequences. "I'm Nora. I've been assigned as your personal attendant." "Assigned," I repeated. She nodded, then seemed to regret the word. "I asked for the post," she added, almost defensively. "I wanted it." I looked at her. She was earnest in the way young people were before life had filed that quality down. There was nothing calculating in her face, which, in this court, already made her unusual. "All right, Nora," I said. "Lead the way." My rooms were in the west wing. They were large and well-appointed. A sitting room, a bedroom, a bathing room with a copper tub that steamed faintly when Nora turned the valves. The furniture was heavy and old, and very beautiful. The kind of beautiful that comes from age rather than effort. Bookshelves lined one full wall of the sitting room, filled with volumes that smelled of dust and cedar. Someone had placed a desk near the window. I stood at that window for a long time after Nora left, looking out at the pine forest. The trees were enormous, their trunks dark with moisture, their upper branches disappearing into the low gray sky. Somewhere beyond them, I knew, the northern mountains began their long rise. I had never been this far north before. There was no warmth in the landscape. But there was a kind of severe honesty to it. Nothing was pretending to be something else. A knock at the door. Not Nora. I turned. A man stood in the doorway. Older. Maybe 50. With a careful face and the kind of posture that suggested he had spent decades being observant in rooms where other people held all the power. He carried a small leather folio. "Mrs. Crest," he said. "My name is Aldrich. I serve as the King's personal secretary. I've been asked to deliver the household guidelines for your role here." Mrs. Crest. The name landed strangely. "What role?" I asked. He opened the folio and withdrew a single folded page, extending it toward me without quite meeting my eyes. "The King has outlined certain expectations. You'll find them here." I took the page. He left. I unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was clean and economical, clearly Aiden's, or dictated by him with precision. A list. Mealtimes at which I was expected to be present for appearances. Court functions I would attend. A note about my allowance. A note about what areas of the court were restricted to me. At the very bottom, a single line, written without preamble. "Do not attempt to speak to me in private settings. Public interaction as required is sufficient. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully, walked to the desk by the window, opened the top drawer, and placed it inside. I closed the drawer. I stood with my hand resting on the smooth wood for a moment, looking out at the pine trees again. The wind had picked up. The forest was moving now, branches swaying in long, slow arcs. I thought about the smell of borrowed perfume on a dress that had never been made for me. I thought about walking down an aisle alone, while a man who had just taken my name refused to acknowledge that I existed. I thought about my father, somewhere in a diminished house, and what his relief must have looked like when they took me instead of him. Something quiet and hard settled in my chest. Not anger, not grief. Something older and calmer than both. I pulled out the chair, sat down at the desk, and opened the top drawer again. I took out a single sheet of blank paper. I picked up a pen, and I began to write. The days at Black Pine Court had a particular rhythm that I learned the way you learn a language spoken around you, but never directly to you. By observation, by inference, by paying attention to things other people had stopped noticing. Breakfast was served at 7 in the Great Hall. Aidan was always already seated when I arrived, flanked by Cole on his left and Aldrich on his right. Papers spread across his end of the long table. Conversation already in motion. I took my seat at the opposite end without ceremony. Nora had told me gently that this was expected. The Alpha King's end of the table was for business, and my presence at the other end was symbolic. Decorative, she hadn't said, but I had heard it anyway. I ate. I watched. I said very little. What I noticed first was that the court ran on tension the way some houses ran on warmth. Not cruelty. I want to be precise about that. No one raised a hand or a voice in the ways I had quietly braced for. But there was a permanent undercurrent of alertness in the people who moved through Black Pine Court, a posture of readiness that never fully relaxed. Guards who stood just slightly too still. Staff who moved through corridors with their eyes slightly downcast, not from fear exactly, but from a long-practiced habit of making themselves small in the presence of power. Even Cole, who was clearly Aidan's closest confidant, and the only person I ever saw speak to him with anything approaching ease, carried something careful in the way he chose his words, like a man who had learned which doors in a house to open slowly. Aidan himself was... I searched for the right word, lying in bed on my 4th night, staring at the ceiling while wind rattled the window glass. Absent. Not in the physical sense. He was present at every required function, punctual, composed, never visibly distracted. But there was a quality to his presence that reminded me of the northern mountains I could see from my window on clear mornings. Enormous, impossible to ignore, and completely indifferent to being looked at. He had not spoken to me since the ceremony, not one word. I had followed his written instruction to the letter, partly because I had no desire to hand him evidence of defiance so early, and partly because something stubborn in me refused to be the one who reached across that particular silence first. If he wanted to pretend I was a piece of furniture that had been delivered and placed, I could be very good furniture. Very quiet. Very observant furniture that read every book on those cedar-smelling shelves, and wrote in a journal every evening and learned the layout of the entire West Wing in precise detail within 5 days. The journal was where everything went that I couldn't say out loud. I had been keeping one since I was 16, since the year my mother left, and my father's drinking moved from occasional to architectural, from something that appeared at the edges of our family to something that became its structure. Writing had always been the way I processed the gap between what was happening and what I was allowed to acknowledge was happening. Words on a page couldn't be dismissed or explained away. They just existed, honest and still. I wrote about the court, about Nora, who brought my tea every morning with a seriousness that suggested she had decided this small act mattered, and was therefore going to perform it with full commitment. About Aldrich, who delivered messages with the expression of a man navigating a field he had mapped very carefully and preferred not to deviate from. About Cole, who I had watched laugh exactly once, a real laugh, sudden and brief, at something a guard said in the corridor, before catching himself and reassembling his composure like a man straightening a jacket. I wrote about Aiden too, though more carefully. Less about what he did, and more about what he didn't do. The way he moved through a room as though he had calculated every possible path through it in advance. The way he listened to reports from his counsel with a stillness that was not passivity, but something more like absorption, taking everything in, releasing nothing. The fact that in 6 days of shared meals, I had never once seen him eat a full plate of food, only consume enough to be functional and then push the rest aside. Small things. The kind of things invisible people noticed. On the 7th day, something changed. I had taken to walking the perimeter of the East Gardens in the late afternoon, after the formal lunch and before the evening assembly. The gardens were severe and beautiful, in the way the rest of Black Pine Court was severe and beautiful. Structured, geometric, kept with precision rather than affection. But there was a section along the eastern wall where the groundskeeper, an old man named Pell, who smelled permanently of soil and pine resin, had allowed something wild to happen. A stretch of low shrubs had grown beyond their intended shape, tangling with the base of the stone wall in a way that was disorganized and, I thought, quietly defiant. I liked that corner. I went there every afternoon and sat on the stone bench that faced it, and I read, or I thought, or I simply sat and let the silence have its way with me. That afternoon I was not alone. A girl was sitting on the ground beside the wild shrubs, 8 years old, perhaps 9. Dark hair loose and tangled, knees pulled to her chest, face turned away from me toward the wall. She was not crying, but the particular stillness of her shoulders suggested she had been recently and was now in the careful aftermath of it. I stopped. I had not been introduced to any children of the court. I knew. In the general way, one knew things about powerful men, that Aiden had no children. The absence of an heir was apparently a matter of ongoing political tension among the elders. But this girl's bearing, the unconscious authority in the set of her jaw even in distress, made me think she was not a servant's child. I sat down on the bench and opened my book. I did not speak to her. After perhaps 5 minutes, she turned and looked at me with dark eyes that were startlingly familiar in their quality. That same contained, measuring quality I had seen in Aiden's face during the ceremony. "You're the new wife," she said. Not unkindly. Factually. "I am," I said. "And you are?" A pause, like she was deciding how much to give. "Sarah, I'm the king's ward." I nodded as though this was information I had expected, though it wasn't. "I'm Hazel." Another pause. She looked at my book. "Is it good?" "So far," I said. "Would you like to sit up here? The ground is cold." She considered this with the gravity of someone making a real decision. Then she stood, brushed dirt from her knees with a dignity that was almost adult, and sat on the opposite end of the bench, leaving a precise and careful distance between us. We sat in silence for a while. It was, I noticed, a companionable silence. Not the cold silence of the great hall, or the loaded silence of the corridors, but something simpler. Two people occupying the same space without demanding anything of each other. Before she left, she said, without looking at me, "The last one didn't come outside." "The last one?" I asked. But she was already walking back toward the main building, her dark hair catching the late light. I asked Nora about it that evening, carefully. Nora went very still in the way she did when a question touched something she wasn't sure she was permitted to answer. Then she set down the tray she was carrying and looked at the middle distance. "Sarah has been the king's ward for 4 years," she said, choosing each word with the precision of someone diffusing something. "Her parents were lost in the conflict. A beat. The same conflict." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The same conflict. My father's betrayal. The intelligence he had passed that had led to loss, to damage, to the kind of rupture that took years to stop bleeding. I sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the pine forest was dark, only the barest outline of trees visible against the night sky. "She lives here?" I asked. "She has her own rooms in the north wing." "The king sees to her education and her needs." Nora paused. He is careful with her." The word careful landed differently than I expected. It was not the word you used for indifference. It was the word you used for something fragile that you were afraid of damaging further. I thought about a man who had built a court that ran on controlled tension and delivered his instructions to his new wife in a written list. I thought about a girl sitting on cold ground beside a wild, untamed stretch of shrubs, and the way she had described the previous occupant of my rooms. The last one didn't come outside. With the flat precision of a child who had learned not to expect too much from the people who pass through. I went to my desk. I opened my journal. I wrote for a long time that night, longer than usual, the pen moving in the quiet, while the wind moved through the pines outside, and the court settled into its nighttime stillness around me. I was beginning to understand that this place had more architecture to it than walls and corridors, that the silences here had weight and history, that the man who refused to look at me was carrying something enormous, and that the girl with his eyes had learned to sit on cold ground rather than ask for warmth. I didn't know yet what to do with any of that, but I was, at least, beginning to see it clearly. And sometimes, I had learned this young, in a house where things were rarely named, sometimes seeing clearly was the first form of power available to you. 3 weeks into my marriage, I made a mistake. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that announces itself with raised voices or broken things. The quiet kind. The kind that happens when you forget, for just a moment, that you are living inside someone else's rules. It was a council morning. I knew this because the entire East Corridor filled with a particular energy on those days. Guards repositioning, Aldrich moving faster than usual, Cole arriving before sunrise with documents tucked under his arm, and the expression of a man who had already made 3 difficult decisions before breakfast. The council met in the old chamber off the main hall, a room I had walked past many times but never entered, its heavy doors always closed. I had not been invited to any council session. I had not expected to be. But that morning, walking back from the gardens earlier than usual because frost had settled overnight and made the stone bench genuinely punishing, I turned a corner and nearly walked directly into Aiden. We were perhaps 2 feet apart. It was the closest I had been to him since the ceremony, and the proximity was startling in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because of anything romantic, but because of sheer physical fact. He was taller than I had registered from a distance, broader, and there was a quality to his stillness up close that was different from how it read across a dining table. Less like composure, more like something being held very carefully in place. He looked at me. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for me to see that his eyes were a dark gray-green, an unexpected color, closer to the forest in winter than to anything warm, and that they registered my presence with the same precise neutrality he applied to everything, a quick assessment, categorization, dismissal. Then he stepped to the side to pass me, and I said, "Good morning." I don't know why I said it. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't defiance. It was simply what came out of my mouth, the automatic social reflex of a person who had been raised to fill silences with courtesy. And for one unguarded moment, I had forgotten that courtesy was not something this particular silence was designed to receive. He stopped. Not for long. A beat, maybe 2. I saw something move across his expression. Not quite surprise. Something more controlled than that. A brief recalibration. And then he walked away without a word, turning into the East Corridor and disappearing toward the council chamber. I stood in the empty hallway for a moment, looking at the space where he had been. Then I walked back to my rooms and sat at my desk and thought about the fact that in 3 weeks, good morning was the most intimate exchange I'd had with the man whose name I now legally carried, and that even that had been too much. I wrote a letter that afternoon, not in my journal, a real letter, on proper paper, addressed to my oldest friend, a woman named Bet, who had grown up in the neighboring territory, who had known me since we were children making bad decisions in creek beds, who had sent me a brief and characteristically understated note when she heard about the marriage. "I assume you're handling this. You always handle things. Write me when you can." I wrote her 6 pages. I wrote about the court and its controlled silences, about Nora and her committed tea service, and the way she went very still when questions got complicated, about Pell the groundskeeper and the wild corner of the East Garden, about Sarah. I wrote about Sarah carefully, not wanting to make her into a symbol of something, just describing the girl as she was, composed and watchful and sitting on cold ground because she'd learned not to ask for warmth. I wrote about the letter of household rules and the line at the bottom, "Do not attempt to speak to me in private settings." I wrote about the wedding dress that smelled like someone else's perfume. I wrote about walking down the aisle alone while 80 people measured the transaction. I wrote about the hallway this morning, and the 3 seconds of eye contact, and the good morning that had escaped before I could stop it. And then, near the end, I wrote something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself, until the pen put it on the page. "I'm not afraid of him, Bet. I think that's what no one here understands. They're all waiting for me to be afraid. The staff, the guards, the elders who look at me like I'm a variable in an equation they haven't solved yet. I think even he's waiting for it. But I've already lived through the thing I was most afraid of, which was becoming something my father could trade away. And it happened. And I'm still here, still thinking, still writing to you at this desk by this window, while the pines do what pines do in November. What I feel is not fear. It's something closer to clarity. I can see this place very plainly. I can see him very plainly. And I think, I'm not certain, but I think that no one in this court has looked at him plainly in a very long time. They look at the position, at the authority, at the capacity for consequence, but not at the man. I wonder what he would do if someone did. I sealed the letter and gave it to Nora to send. 2 days later, Cole appeared at my sitting room door. He was a man of perhaps 40, with the kind of face that had once been open and had gradually acquired layers. Not hardness exactly, but density, the accumulation of years spent in proximity to difficult decisions. He was polite. He was also, I sensed immediately, not here for a social call. "Mrs. Crest," he said, "do you have a moment?" I set down my book. Of course. He came in and stood rather than sitting, which told me something. He looked around the room briefly, at the bookshelves, at the desk by the window, at the journal I'd closed and set aside, with the quick inventory of a man who assessed spaces professionally. "I'll be direct," he said, which I appreciated. "There are members of the Elder Council who have questions about your adjustment to court life. Some concern has been expressed about your daily movements, the garden visits, the time you spend with the ward." I looked at him steadily. "I sit in the garden and read. I exchange perhaps 40 words with Sarah over the course of 2 weeks. Is that a security concern?" A slight pause. "It's a question of propriety. Your role here is symbolic," I said. "Yes, I'm aware." He looked at me then with a different quality of attention, a recalibration, similar to what I'd seen in Aiden's face in the hallway, but warmer. More openly curious. "The elders are traditional," he said after a moment. "They have expectations about how the king's wife conducts herself." "What expectations, specifically?" Another pause. He seemed to be deciding something. "Quieter ones," he said finally. And there was something in his tone, dry, almost wry, that suggested this was not entirely his own view. "I see," I said. "Thank you for telling me directly." He nodded, moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "Sarah has eaten dinner in the main hall 3 times this week, She hasn't done that in months. He left before I could respond. I thought about that for a long time. Sarah at dinner. Sarah who had learned not to expect warmth from people who passed through. Sarah with Aiden's eyes and a self-containment that was too old for her age, sitting on cold ground in the corner of a garden where something wild had been allowed to grow. And Aiden, who saw to her education and her needs, who was careful with her in the way you were careful with something you were afraid of breaking further. Who was the reason she was here? Who was also, in the tangled, brutal logic of what my father had done, part of the reason her parents weren't. I thought about how grief and guilt could calcify into something that looked like coldness from the outside. How a person could build such perfect control around a wound that eventually even they forgot the wound was there. I wasn't making excuses for him. I want to be clear about that. The list of rules, the wedding dress, the 3 weeks of practiced absence. None of that became acceptable simply because pain might explain it, but explanation and excuse were different things. And I had always been someone who needed to understand the architecture of a situation before I could decide what to do inside it. I went to my desk. I took out a fresh sheet of paper. This time, I didn't write to Bet. I wrote something else entirely. Something I wasn't sure I would ever send. Something that was more for the act of writing it than for any intended reader. I wrote carefully and honestly about what I observed, what I thought, what I suspected lay beneath the surface of this court and this marriage, and this man who had never once looked at me. I finished. I folded the page. I held it for a moment. Then I placed it in the back of my journal, pressed between the last written page and the cover, and I closed it. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun to fall. Slow and deliberate. Settling on the pine branches in the darkness, covering the garden, the wild corner, the cold stone bench. I watched it for a long time before I went to bed. The snow changed the court. Not its structure or its silences. Those remained exactly as they had been, as fixed as the stone walls themselves. But snow did something to the light inside Black Pine Court, softened the edges of rooms that usually felt carved from granite, turned the tall windows into frames for something almost gentle. Even the pine forest looked different, quieter, more deliberate, as though it had decided to rest. I noticed it first at breakfast on the morning after the first real snowfall, when the gray light coming through the great hall windows was diffused and pale and made everyone at the long table look briefly, strangely human. Even Aiden, at his end of the table, surrounded by papers and Cole's low-voiced reports, looked for a moment less like an institution and more like a person who had not slept well. He was rubbing the side of his jaw with 2 fingers. A small private gesture, the kind people made when they thought no one was watching. Gone in a second. But I had seen it. I looked back down at my plate. Small things. I was always collecting small things. It was Sarah who created the situation, though I don't think she intended to. We had developed, over the weeks, a quiet companionship that neither of us had formally acknowledged or named. She appeared in the East Garden most afternoons, sometimes sitting near me, sometimes simply occupying the same space at a comfortable distance. We talked occasionally, about books mostly, because it turned out Sarah read voraciously and had opinions about it that were sharp and precise and entirely her own. She had recently finished a history of the Northern Mountain clans and found it, she told me, mostly accurate but condescending in the footnotes. I had laughed out loud at that. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded. Sarah had looked briefly pleased, and then immediately reassembled her composure, which was so precisely like something I had seen Aiden do that I had to look away. That afternoon, 2 days after the snow, we were sitting together when she said, without preamble, "Can I show you something?" She led me through a part of the West Wing I hadn't explored, past a series of closed doors and down a narrow staircase to a lower level that smelled of old wood and cold stone. At the end of a short corridor was a room that had clearly once been a library of some kind, smaller than the main court library, with shelves built into all 4 walls and a low ceiling, that made it feel enclosed and private. Most of the shelves were empty now, but in the center of the room was a large table, and spread across it were maps. Dozens of them. Old ones, the paper thick and browned at the edges, the lines drawn in faded ink, northern territories, mountain passes, pack boundaries marked in a system of symbols I didn't immediately recognize. Some had notes written in the margins, cramped, careful handwriting in dark ink. "He comes here sometimes," Sarah said, standing beside me. "At night, when he can't sleep. I heard him once and looked in." She paused. "He doesn't know I know about this room." I looked at the maps, at the margin notes, at the careful, controlled handwriting that I recognized from the list of household rules, from the single line at the bottom, "Do not attempt to speak to me in private settings," and felt something shift very slightly in my understanding. These were not administrative maps. The notes in the margins were not political calculations. They were, I leaned closer, reading carefully. They were accounts, records of specific places. A mountain pass with a note that read 4 hours in poor weather, possible shelter at the eastern ridge, a river crossing marked with a date from 5 years ago, and 2 words I had to read twice. They waited here. They. I straightened slowly. "Sarah," I said carefully, "when did he start coming to this room?" She thought about it. "After I came to live here," she said. "So, 4 years ago." 4 years of coming to a room full of maps at night. 4 years of margin notes that read like a man retracing a route he couldn't stop walking in his mind. 4 years of careful, controlled days, and whatever this room was at night. I did not touch anything. I looked for a long time, and then I stepped back from the table. "We should go," I said quietly. Sarah nodded and she looked, for just a moment, before she closed the room's expression back down, relieved that I had said it that way. Not we shouldn't be here. Not this was a mistake. Just, we should go. As though we had simply decided to move on to the next thing. She was a remarkable child. I thought about that all the way back up the narrow staircase. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Not Bet's reply, though that came too. 2 days later, 6 pages of characteristic Bet, pragmatic and affectionate in equal measure, ending with, "I always said your brain was wasted on that territory. Put it to work." No. This letter came from outside the court, delivered through official channels, and Aldrich brought it to me personally, which was unusual enough that I noticed it before I even took the envelope from his hand. "This came through the Northern Post," he said. His voice was carefully neutral in the way it was when he was managing information. "Addressed to you directly." I looked at the handwriting on the envelope. My father's. I hadn't heard from Elias Voss since the day Mira had come to collect me. He had stood in the doorway of his study while I carried my bag to the car, not watching me go, exactly, more allowing it to happen in his peripheral vision, the way people allowed difficult things to pass through their line of sight without fully registering them. He had not come outside. He had not said goodbye. I took the envelope from Aldrich. I waited until he left. Then I sat at my desk and opened it. The letter was short. My father's writing had the quality it always had when he was being strategic rather than honest, controlled and slightly formal, like a man performing sobriety. He wrote that he hoped I was settling in. He wrote that the estate had been quiet. And then, near the end, he wrote something that changed the temperature of the room. "I want you to know, Hazel, that what happened 5 years ago was more complicated than anyone understands. There are things Aiden Crest has never been told, about what I was given, and what I was threatened with, and why I made the choices I made. I'm telling you this because you are in a position now to make him understand. I'm telling you because you are my daughter, and I know you'll do what's right for this family." I read it twice, 3 times. Then I set it down on the desk and sat very still for a long moment, looking at the pine trees through the window, watching snow fall from the higher branches in small cascades when the wind moved through them. "You are in a position now to make him understand. There it was. The actual purpose of the letter, arriving wrapped in the performance of parental concern. My father had not written to check on me. He had written because he had calculated that I might, after weeks in this court, have developed enough proximity to the Alpha King to be useful as a messenger, as an advocate, as the instrument of his rehabilitation. I was still a transaction, just a different one now. I thought about the maps room, about the margin notes and the dates and the 2 words. They waited here. I thought about Sarah at dinner 3 times in 1 week for the first time in months, and Nora's careful silences, and Cole's dry, almost warmth, and the brief, unguarded gesture of a man rubbing his jaw in morning light when he thought no one was watching. I thought about my father in his diminished house, composing a strategic letter, believing, because he had always believed it, that the people around him existed primarily in relation to his needs. I picked up my pen. I did not write to my father. I turned to a fresh page in my journal, and I wrote instead, quickly and without stopping, every thought that was moving through me. The anger I hadn't let myself fully feel until now. The exhaustion of being a piece moved across other people's boards. The particular grief of recognizing, cleanly and without illusion, that a parent has never learned to see you as a separate person. I wrote until the feeling had a shape on the page instead of just a weight in my chest. Then I stopped, and I looked at what I had written. And I realized that without planning it, without meaning to, I had written something that was no longer just private processing. I had written something that was honest and clear, and said, in careful plain language, exactly what it was to be in this court and in this marriage, and to see, really see, the damage that my father's choices had left behind in ways he had never once considered. I had written it to no one. I had written it for myself. But I looked at it for a long time. And then, without fully understanding why, some instinct older and quieter than reason, I folded it carefully. Not like a journal entry. Like a letter. I wrote nothing on the outside. I placed it on the corner of my desk. I was not going to send it. I was almost certain I was not going to send it. Outside, the snow kept falling in the failing afternoon light, slow and patient, covering everything it touched in a layer of temporary white, the way certain kinds of honesty covered things, not hiding them exactly, just making them visible in a different way. It was Nora who took it by mistake. She came the next morning to collect the outgoing correspondence. Bet's reply, a request to the court library, a note to Pell about the East Garden bench needing repair. I had left the folded page on the corner of my desk, apart from the others, and I was in the bathing room when she came in. When I returned, the desk was clear. I stood very still. Then I walked quickly to the door and looked down the corridor. Nora was already at the far end, turning the corner toward the mailroom, her arms full of envelopes. I almost called after her. I stood in the doorway with my hand on the frame and my mouth open and the word Nora fully formed and ready. And then something stopped me. Not paralysis, not fear. Something quieter and more deliberate. The sense that whatever was about to happen had been set in motion by something true, and that interrupting it was a choice I needed to make consciously, not reflexively. I stood there for 5 full seconds. Then I stepped back inside and closed the door. I did not sleep that night. Not from dread, exactly. Something more like the particular alertness that comes when you have made a decision, or allowed one to be made, and your body hasn't caught up to the fact that there is nothing left to do but wait. I lay in the dark and listened to the wind move through the pines and thought about what was written on that folded page. Every sentence in the order I had written them, the way you might retrace a path you had walked in daylight while standing in the dark. I had written about my father's letter, about the calculation behind it, about what it meant to be handed from one set of hands to another and told each time that this was love or duty or necessity. I had written about the maps room and what I thought it meant, carefully, without presumption, only what I had observed and what it made me feel. I had written about Sarah and the cold ground and the wild corner of the garden. I had written about 3 weeks of silence and a single good morning that had fallen into the space between us like a stone into deep water. And at the end, I had written this: I don't know what you were told about me, or what you expected when you made this arrangement. I don't know if you've thought about me at all, beyond what is politically necessary, and I understand if you haven't. But I want you to know, and I'm writing this to myself, not to you, because I'm not sure I'm brave enough to say it to your face, that I am not my father. I am not his apology, or his representative, or his second attempt at negotiating better terms. I am a person who has been watching this court very carefully for 3 weeks, and what I see is not what I expected. What I see is a place that has been holding its breath for a very long time. And a man who goes to a room full of maps at night, because he cannot stop retracing the cost of something he couldn't prevent. I don't say that to diminish what was lost. I say it because I recognize the shape of that kind of grief. And I think you have been carrying it alone so long that you've forgotten it has a shape at all. I'm not asking for anything. I'm not my father making a calculation. I just thought someone should say it plainly, even if only on a page that no one reads. That was what Nora had taken to the mailroom. That was what was now. I didn't know where. Moving through the court's internal delivery system toward some destination I couldn't control. I turned onto my side and looked at the window. The snow had stopped. The sky was very dark and very clear. The kind of clear that came after weather had passed through and taken everything unsettled with it. I thought, well, now we wait. 3 days passed without anything happening. Or rather, things happened, but not the thing I was waiting for. Breakfast, the garden. Sarah, who had started bringing her own book to our afternoon sessions and reading beside me in a silence that had become genuinely comfortable. Cole, who nodded to me in corridors now, with a warmth that had not been there a month ago. Nora, who had realized what she'd done. I could see it in her face. The careful apprehension she carried for 2 full days, before I told her quietly that it was all right, that I had chosen not to call her back, and watched the tension go out of her shoulders like air from something that had been held too tight. On the 4th day, Aldrich came to my rooms at mid-morning. "The king would like to see you," he said, "in the study, now, if you're available." I set down my book. "Of course," I said. The study was on the 2nd floor of the main building, east-facing, with 2 windows that looked out over the front approach to the court and the long tree-lined road that disappeared into the forest. It was a working room, not the formal receiving room where Aiden met with delegations, but a private space with the texture of real use. Papers on the desk, a coat thrown over a chair, bookshelves that had been organized by function rather than appearance, which meant they looked inhabited rather than decorative. Aiden was standing at one of the windows when I entered. He turned when I came in. He was holding the folded page. I had known he would be. I had spent 4 days knowing he would be. But seeing it in his actual hand, the paper slightly worn at the fold from being opened and closed more than once, did something unexpected to my composure. Not fear. Something more exposed than fear. I stood in the center of the room and waited. He looked at me for a long moment. Longer than the 3 seconds in the corridor. Long enough that I could see him deciding something. Not what to say, I thought, but how to say it. The difference between a man who hasn't considered something and a man who has considered it too much. "Sit down," he said. His voice was the same as at the ceremony. Level, precise. But something in it was different, less rehearsed. I sat in the chair across from the desk. He remained standing, which I thought was not power positioning, but simply the habit of a man who processed difficult things on his feet. "You wrote that you're not your father," he said. "I'm not. You wrote that you recognize the shape of grief." A pause. What did you mean by that? It wasn't quite a question. It was the way people spoke when they already knew the answer and wanted to hear how you arrived at it. "My mother left when I was 16, I said. My father's response was to make himself unavailable in a different way. I spent a long time in a house with someone who was present in every practical sense and completely unreachable in every real one. I kept my voice even. You learn to recognize that particular shape, the way someone can be in a room and still be entirely alone in it. Something moved across his face, brief and contained, but there. The maps room, he said. Sarah showed me. She wanted to show me something that mattered to her. I don't think she understood entirely why. A silence. He looked down at the page in his hand, then set it on the desk between us, not pushing it away, just placing it down, as though setting aside something he'd been carrying at an angle that was no longer necessary. Your father wrote to you, he said. Yes. I know what he wrote. Our correspondence is monitored as a condition of the arrangement. He looked at me directly. I expected you to come to me with it, to advocate for him. I know, I said. But you didn't. No. Another silence, longer this time. Outside, pale winter light moved across the room as a cloud passed somewhere above, and I watched it travel across the floor between us. Why not? He asked. I thought about how to answer that honestly, without it sounding like a performance of virtue. Because it would have been using you, I said finally. And I've been used as a tool by someone who was supposed to protect me, and I know what it feels like from the inside. I didn't want to be that to someone else, even for leverage I might have actually wanted. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said very carefully, I didn't choose this marriage to punish you. I know that, I said. You chose it to punish him, and I was the available instrument. I understood that from the beginning. Something in his jaw tightened, not anger, something more uncomfortable than anger. The expression of a person confronted with a plain truth about themselves that they have been keeping slightly out of focus. That was wrong, he said. The words were sparse and undecorated, the way an admission was when it came from someone who did not make them easily. I looked at him. Yes, I said. It was. He didn't flinch from that. I respected it. We sat in silence for a moment that felt like something being cleared between us. Not resolved, not repaired, but cleared, like snow after weather has passed. Sarah eats dinner in the hall now, he said finally. I noticed. She hasn't done that since. He stopped, started again. She stopped after her parents. She said the room was too loud, too many people. A pause. She told me last week that it doesn't feel as loud anymore. I didn't say anything. I let that sit where he had put it. He looked at the folded page on the desk, then at me. You said you weren't asking for anything. I'm not. I know. A beat. I'm asking anyway. What do you need? The question surprised me enough that I didn't answer immediately. I looked at him. Really looked, the way I had been looking at this court for weeks, plainly and without the distortion of fear or expectation. And I saw a man who was not comfortable asking that question, who had probably not asked it in years, who was asking it now because something on a folded piece of paper had reached past the architecture of his control and found whatever was still unguarded underneath. Time, I said finally, and to not be invisible. He nodded slowly, as though both of those things were reasonable, as though he had the capacity to provide them, and was deciding in this moment to do so. What followed was not a transformation. I want to be honest about that. It was slower and less dramatic, and more real than transformation. Which is to say, it was a gradual change in the texture of daily life, the kind of change that you only recognized in retrospect as having been change at all. Aiden began acknowledging me at breakfast. Not performances, no sudden warmth for the benefit of the court. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a person choosing to include another person in their peripheral awareness. A look across the table, a comment directed at my end. Small, precise, genuine. He came to the East Garden once, on a Sunday afternoon when the snow had partially thawed, and the wild corner looked like something in the process of becoming. He did not stay long. He stood at a distance and looked at the garden with the expression of a man seeing something familiar from a new angle. He said, "Pell never trimmed that corner. My mother planted those shrubs." He said he didn't have the heart. I looked at the tangle of branches and thought about wildness allowed to persist in a place governed by precision. "I'm glad he didn't," I said. Aiden looked at me. "So am I," he said, and then he left. My father wrote again in the spring. A longer letter this time, the strategy more elaborate, the appeal more emotional. I read it carefully, and then I wrote back. Not on his behalf to Aiden, but directly to him. 2 pages, plain and honest. I told him that I would not be his instrument here. I told him that I hoped he would find a way to account for what he had done that didn't require someone else to carry it for him. I told him I was well, and that I intended to remain so, and that I wished him the same. I sealed it and gave it to Aldrich and did not read it again. Sarah turned 10 in April. She asked, very formally, if I would attend her small celebration dinner. I told her I would. I brought her the history of the Northern Mountain clans that I had found in the main library, a better edition than the one she'd read, with annotations that I suspected she would find satisfying, and footnotes that I was fairly certain she would argue with. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "You actually listened," she said, with the slight amazement of someone unaccustomed to being heard. "I always listen," I said. Aiden was at the dinner. He sat across from me and next to Sarah, and at one point, when Sarah was making a sharp and confident argument about the inaccuracy of a particular historical account, he caught my eye across the table with an expression that was, briefly, quietly, entirely, genuinely, something close to warmth. It lasted a moment. Then it was gone. But I had seen it. I was always collecting small things. By summer, Black Pine Court breathed differently. Not loudly, not dramatically. But the quality of the silences had changed. They were no longer the silences of people holding their breath, but the silences of people who had learned that the space between words did not have to be dangerous. Cole stopped choosing his words quite so carefully around me. Nora stopped looking alarmed when I asked questions. Aldrich, who I suspected had always had opinions he carefully declined to share, began occasionally allowing the corner of his mouth to suggest them. And Aiden was, slowly and with the painstaking care of someone dismantling something they had built over many years, learning to be in the same room as another person without treating that proximity as a threat. He was not easy. He was not simple. He carried his history the way the Northern Mountains carried their height. It was simply part of his shape, and it would never fully change. But on an evening in late July, when the sky over the pine forest was the particular shade of blue that came just before full dark, he found me at the desk by my window, writing, and he knocked on the open door and asked if I wanted to walk. Not formally, not for appearances, just, did I want to walk? I put down my pen. "Yes," I said. "Let me get my coat." We walked through the east garden in the long summer dusk, past the wild corner where my mother's shrubs had grown back into something impossible to contain, past the stone bench, down toward the edge of the property where the pine forest began its quiet enormity. We didn't talk about my father, or the maps room, or the letter, or the list of household rules. Those things had been said, in one form or another, and they didn't need to be said again. We talked about the forest, about the northern mountain routes he knew from memory, about a book I was reading, about Sarah's footnote arguments, which made him briefly, genuinely smile in a way I had never seen before. It changed his whole face, made it younger and less finished, and then it settled back into its usual composure, but left something different in its wake. When we turned back toward the court, the lights in the windows were warm against the darkening sky, and the pines were very still, and I thought, this is what it looks like when a place stops holding its breath. He walked beside me. Not apart, Beside, I am not going to tell you it was simple after that, or that old wounds closed cleanly, or that a man shaped by years of controlled isolation became someone uncomplicated to love. None of that would be true, and I have never been interested in trading the truth for a more comfortable story. What I will tell you is this. The wedding dress that smelled like someone else's perfume was put away in the back of a closet and eventually given to the court's charitable stores. The list of household rules remained in my desk drawer, not as a wound, but as a record, proof of a starting point and how far from it we had traveled. The desk by the window became mine in a way that no room had ever been mine before. The east garden became mine. The wild corner with its impossible shrubs became mine. And Black Pine Court, stone-walled, pine-dark, severe and honest, and unwilling to pretend to be something it wasn't, became, in the slow and genuine way that real things became, home. Sarah grew. Nora eventually stopped bringing tea with the seriousness of someone performing a sacred rite, and started bringing it with the ease of someone who had simply decided this was part of her mourning. Cole laughed more often and caught himself less. Pell kept not trimming the east corner, and the shrubs grew wider every spring. And Aiden, who had married me for the wrong reasons and spent 3 weeks refusing to look at me and gone to a room full of maps at night to retrace the cost of things he couldn't prevent, Aiden learned, slowly and imperfectly, and with great effort, to let another person see him plainly, and found, I think, that it did not destroy him. It turned out that being seen clearly by someone who was not afraid of what they saw was not the threat he had spent years fortifying against. It turned out it was the thing he had needed most. On a morning in the following November, exactly 1 year after the snow had begun, and I had accidentally released an unsealed letter into the world, I sat at my desk and wrote to Bet. You told me to put my brain to work. I did. It worked out. She wrote back 4 days later, 6 pages as always, ending with, I always knew it would. You were never furniture, Hazel. You were the person who noticed what the furniture was hiding. I folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer, beside the list of household rules. Outside, the first snow of the new winter had begun to fall, slow and deliberate and patient, settling on the pines, covering the garden, filling the wild corner with white. Inside there was warmth, and it was ours.